with Sam Seder.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, July 21st, 2022. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live, steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Paris Marx, author of Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. Meanwhile, the January 6th committee hearings are on prime time tonight, which means something big will probably be revealed. And word on the street is that Trump himself, particularly the 187 minutes that Trump failed to act on that day, will be the focus. And speaking of Trump, the guy's still at it. Less than 2 weeks ago, Trump reportedly called the Speaker of the Wisconsin Assembly and asked him to overturn the results of the 2020 election in the state. It's 2022. This is the hardest this guy has worked at anything in his life.
Never too late to do the right thing.
And Rudy Giuliani has been ordered to testify in Georgia's criminal probe into election interference in that state.
I'd say if a criminal probe is looking into Giuliani, it's going all right.
Yeah, right. I mean, and Rudy, just a reminder, it's Georgia the state, not Georgia the country. We don't need another Four Seasons situation on our hands. While Biden has COVID, Kamala Harris is secretly very happy. Just kidding. That's an editorial. But he's double boosted, so hopefully he should be okay. After the House successfully voted to codify marriage equality, they have also scheduled a vote to do the same with contraceptive access, which is good. Now the Senate has to do its job. In abortion news, a federal appeals court panel has allowed a Georgia 6-week abortion ban to take effect immediately. And lastly, nearly 100 million Americans are currently facing excessive heat in a majority of states, including here, for sure. All this and more on today's program. Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank everybody for tuning in yesterday to the tribute to Michael Brooks. Left Reckoning also did one last night. How'd that go, Matt?
It was good. We had a bunch of guys, the Woke Bros, Bessner, Burgess, Gene Bajalan, or as I like to call all of us, the Brooks Brothers last night. We had a good post-game talk about Michael for about a couple hours and a good show talking to Jason Miles. So, yeah, check that out if you want a little bit more. And I appreciate all everybody's comments. It's a strange sort of solace that comes with that anniversary.
Yeah, well said, and I can't wait to check that out. I mentioned that the House passed marriage equality the other day. That's been sent to the Senate. It's the Respect for Marriage Act, and that would codify federal protections for same-sex couples that were put in place in 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled on it. 47 Republicans voted yes in the House, so it passed with some bipartisan support. Now it goes to the Senate. McConnell won't say if he supports it or not, but you already have 4 yeses thus far on the Republican side. Susan Collins, Rob Portman of Ohio, Lisa Murkowski, and Tom Tillis have said that they will support it. So that's 4. But Schumer is basically saying that he's not going to bring it to the floor unless he knows that it's going to pass. Now, he's waffled on that a bit because there's been a lot of pushback, but here was his initial press release on that very topic. It's hard for me to read this here, but if we could just go full screen. He says, I want to say something about the House passed Respect for Marriage Act, which would enshrine marriage equality into federal law, which I fully and strongly support. This legislation is so important. I was really impressed by how much bipartisan support it got in the House. It passed 267 to 157. 47 Republicans, about a quarter, a little less than a quarter of their caucus, maybe a fifth voted for the bill. The legislation is so important. I spoke to Senator Baldwin, who is one of the leaders of this legislation in the Senate this morning, and she is talking to Republicans to see where the support is. I want to bring this bill to the floor, and we're working to get the necessary Senate Republican support to ensure it would pass. So I just want to remind people that the Democrats have tried this tactic many, many times in the past. They have tried to get Republican support before the bill comes to the floor in the Senate to pass the filibuster threshold. They have to get those 60 votes, which is another reminder that this is why we should eliminate the filibuster. But they give Republicans time to breathe on these issues. We saw this with Build Back Better. We saw it with, basically every type of legislation that the Biden administration has tried to pass. You bring it to the floor immediately and don't give them time to get their bearings. Don't give them time to, as a caucus, figure out how strategically they can vote on this, which members are least vulnerable so they can shoot this down, which members can afford to take this vote because they don't have an election coming up anytime soon, which senators need to do this because their home state constituency is in favor of it, because they're in a purple state or in a blue state and they're on the Republican side. Whatever the case may be, you can't give them time to breathe because they'll strategize. That's why McConnell is not being open about his position yet, is because they're trying to figure out a way how to get around this. And McConnell, I mean, they need to be doing this, in my opinion, for all of the cases that Thomas cited in his concurring opinion when they struck down Roe. Now, that goes for Griswold, that goes for Obergefell, which is the gay marriage decision, which is what passing this in the Senate would do. It would nullify it, essentially, codify it into law. But if the Supreme Court decides to take it up, this would be a way to combat that. Lawrence, etc. They should do this for every for every case that Thomas cited there, because what he did in that concurring opinion when they struck down Roe was say to state legislatures, any rights that are not procedural, like the right to a fair trial, or any right that isn't said and enumerated explicitly in the Constitution, explicitly, it's fair game. It's fair game. Labor rights are going to be on the docket as well. And just come to us, come to this extremist Supreme Court, and we will overturn it for you. And so the Democrats have to act with that urgency because Thomas explicitly said what he wants to do in that concurring opinion. And I'm just flabbergasted that they're going to give Republicans time to breathe on this and collect the votes before they vote on it.
Well, let's be descriptive about it. This is, once again, Chuck Schumer's Senate Democrats being complicit with basically a fascist takeover of the country, like it was with the letting the Supreme Court justices through. We're gonna let Dianne Feinstein nod along, and we're just gonna allow this stuff because something Senate
procedure, and it's path of least resistance.
And there's just no excuse for it. And I mean, Chuck Schumer may have been soft on this. He needs to cave immediately, and they need to bring it to a vote. This entire, if we're not going to get anything else, it needs to be putting things on the record for where they stand. And it's ridiculous that Chuck Schumer's reaching out. It's ridiculous.
And just a quick point before we go. Ted Cruz over on his podcast a few days ago was like, he thinks Obergefell was wrongfully decided, but his comms guy was literally in every person's mention putting that tweet out there with that video being like, you didn't hear the rest of his quote. He said that he doesn't think the court has an appetite to overturn it. He doesn't think that they will want to do that because there will be so many gay couples who will be in disarray afterwards. Yeah, I'm really, you know what? I'm pretty reassured about that.
Yeah.
Now, actually, you know, now that a Republican senator is qualifying that he doesn't think the Supreme Court might overturn a long-standing precedent, I'm reassured.
They literally did this with abortion. They pretend like, Kavanaugh said it's settled law. He lied. He lied. They all lie, and that's the only way that these extremists can get away with their Christian fascist agenda, is to hide the ball until it's time to strike, and then they do it, and then they naturalize it. And so, say it fails. Say it fails. Say it, you get 59 votes, you get 9 Republicans on your side, and marriage equality fails. Then you hit them over the head with it in the midterms.
And people know the urgency of the situation, as
Yes.
opposed to denying it and acting like some fairy tale is going to come together and save us all in the end.
I mean, they right. They just want there to be a cloak of procedure. So one, there also isn't a growing push to eliminate the filibuster in general, which is a way for them to also hide hide behind doing nothing. The Senate, if it continues to go down this road, needs to go the way of the House of Lords in the UK as a purely rubber stamping or slowing agent in the government.
That's
because it is not a democratic, it is not a small d democratic institution. It is actively harming this country, and Chuck Schumer, with his commitment to process and also ego, because he wants bills to pass, he wants to check off a win column for himself, is not doing what's in the best interests of the American public with this strategy.
That's the idea. Is I think the squad to get into the bloodstream next is we've started delegitimizing the Supreme Court. That's great. Let's start delegitimizing the Senate too.
100%. So it's just, I hope his strategy changes, because pausing and giving Republicans time, it's not going to go well. And I have deep fears about what the next few decades holds in terms of the Supreme Court overturning precedent. And this is the time now, in the wake of Roe, to target those and protect, I should say, the targets of the Supreme Court: gay marriage, contraception, and more. Do it preemptively, because mark my words, they're going to come for it, and Thomas has said as much. All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be joined by Paris Marx. We are back, and we are joined now by Paris Marx, author of Road to Nowhere: What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. And it just came out, so congratulations on your book, Paris.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thanks for having me on the program. Really excited to chat with you about it.
I was saying before we got started that I'm so excited for this interview because, Elon Musk has been in the news. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, Paris.
Yeah, he's in the news sometimes. Occasionally he gets
occasionally. What's the running body count for how many people his self-driving car tests have killed?
Oh my God, it's at least in the tens. I know the transportation regulator is investigating. I think it's like 37 crashes right now. Some of them fatal, some of them not. So yeah, it's definitely not great.
Definitely not. So your book really focuses on how there's this trust in technology, almost a blind trust. I think part of it is people don't understand it, and it also is this great white capitalist hope, right? Where all of our problems can be solved by this ethereal, difficult to understand, but ever solving technology, and that it's going to be the thing that saves us. And your book is very much not under that illusion. What do you make of that blind trust, and why did you feel that it was necessary to combat it, particularly in the context of transportation in your book?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I think that those ideas really go back a really long time, right? We often have this association between technology and progress, right? Just because this new technology is invented, the idea is that, this is naturally the way that society should work, and we should adopt this, and this is what the future should be, right? And the book is certainly trying to say, like, let's hold on for a second there. Let's make sure that these technologies are actually in service of us as people, not just in service of these corporations that are putting them out into the world. And so the reason that I chose transportation to focus on it, beyond the fact that it's just something that I've been writing about for years and am very interested in, is that I think it does provide a good kind of illustration of these impacts of these dynamics, right? When we look at what Silicon Valley companies have been proposing for transportation over the past 10 years or so, whether it's Uber and the ride hailing services or autonomous vehicles or these other proposals that they have, and then looking at the history of these ideas, looking at the history of automobility more broadly, which we can certainly see as a disruption, quote unquote, of the transportation system. If we're thinking about what Silicon Valley likes to say about, what they do and their effect on society. And so I think it really kind of illustrates to us that we should definitely be more critical of what Silicon Valley is telling us their impact on the world is, and to ensure that these technologies, if we're going to adopt them, are actually going to help us and benefit us, rather than just, kind of laying down and accepting whatever Silicon Valley wants us to accept.
Yeah, they also just, it is their thing to overpromise and underdeliver. I mean, that we see that across sectors, and I keep thinking back to, of course, the infamous Theranos example, right? But that's
Yeah.
it's instructive, largely about the way that Silicon Valley perceives itself. And when it comes to something like transportation, where people's lives are on the line, and it also has so much to do with how our country is structured, just in terms of infrastructure, that's a big thing to play around with.
Absolutely. The transportation system is so key, like, to people getting around, to people being able to access the services, get to their jobs, visit their friends, anything, right? You're dealing with the transportation system. And if we look at the transportation system that we have, you're in the US, I'm in Canada, North America, we're both very auto-dominated societies. It's been built up over time to make it so that most people need an automobile to get around, right? It's not even really a choice. You need to be reliant on this. And that has had a whole load of consequences. Just last year, the United States hit, a new record, as high as it's been since the 1990s, of road deaths. For over 42,000 people were killed on American roads, and that has increased significantly in recent years. I think that is reason alone to be concerned about this. But then if we look at, the impact that it's had on our communities, as we've built these really kind of sprawled out suburbs rather than, dense communities where we try to encourage some degree of, community life, I guess, that has really been lost. We look at the health effects of sitting in these cars for all this time, the environmental impacts, of course, of the local pollution, but also on climate change. There's so many reasons that we should want to look at this transportation system that we have and try to improve it. And certainly these tech companies, over the past decade or so have used that to promote themselves and to say, look, we have the solutions to all of your problems. But then if we look at what has actually come, we see that they haven't really solved much at all.
And the solution is one that centers around individual transportation, personalized transportation, which is obviously it undercuts their glowing vision of themselves as environmental saviors, particularly Elon Musk. And I want to get into that in a bit. But the first chapter of your book really gets into the history of the car and how the U.S. became, and North America more broadly, very fertile ground for this kind of techie, individualized transport time that we find ourselves in now. So let's go through that history a little bit. How did the automobile become completely necessary to exist in a great majority of places in our country and in North America broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really kind of interesting to look back at it and to think like, Uber and Elon Musk and all these people have been telling us for the past decade or so that they're going to disrupt the transportation system, right? But really, we're all still dependent on cars. They haven't really changed a whole lot. But if we look back at, the turn of the century, the late 1800s, early 1900s, when the automobile is really emerging, that is really like a moment of proper disruption, right? This new technology is being invented, it's being put onto the road, but it's not the technology itself that really causes these changes. So if we look at the street in that moment, there are plenty of different ways to use it. There are plenty of different people using it. People are walking on the street, people are taking bikes, people are on the streetcar, people are in horse-drawn carriages. There's little street vendors along the side of the street. On the side streets, children will be playing in the streets, right? So there are all these different uses, not just completely dominated by the car, but the car enters and it doesn't fit within those norms, right? Because it's going faster than everything else. It can move in ways that other forms of transportation can't. And you start to see more deaths on the road, particularly children and young women. And naturally, because these automobiles are not a mass product at the moment, they're very much a luxury product. Certain people are benefiting, but much of society is not, right? And are being put in greater danger by these vehicles that are increasingly on the roads and taking away their space as well. And so there are protests, right? There are opposition to this. People don't want the automobile to take over the streets in their cities. And at that time, people are really living in dense cities. There's not so much suburbs as we have today. And so what we see is that the industries, the kind of economic interests that are associated with the automobile start to work together, right? To not only change the way that people think about the street, but also to lobby the government in order to get them to change regulations, change policies, to subsidize the rollout of automobility. That's the auto companies, the suppliers to the auto companies, the oil companies, construction interests, because they'll be building the roads in the suburban communities to follow. And so there are plenty of reasons why these, companies will see a benefit to making this change. And so they get the government to kind of go along with that to ensure that it gets rolled out. And particularly in the post-war period, that's when we really see that expansion start to happen, when they're building out the interstate highway system. They're subsidizing mortgages so that people are moving out to suburbs. All of these things are happening in that moment to make people dependent on the automobile.
And that post World War kind of infrastructure building, it's really seen as, or written as in our history, as this positive development and this expansion of the country and this new frontier. But in terms of the city and what it did to the infrastructure of cities in our country, as you write, it was really cities and rural communities. But the suburbs come out of the advent and the proliferation of the automobile. What did it do to our cities, and what did it do in terms of creating this mid-tier between rural and urban life with the suburb?
Yeah, like if you think about the automobile, obviously it takes up quite a bit of space, right? And so if you want a lot of people to own cars, it just doesn't work for people to live in dense cities anymore, because you can't have people living in, apartment buildings or condos or what have you, and then also have their automobile. Like, where are you going to park it? And so that's when, the auto companies and certainly governments that are supporting this vision, recognize that there needs to be this suburban expansion, right? And so through the FHA, Federal Housing Association, I think it's called. They subsidize the build out of these suburban communities because they make it much more accessible for people to get mortgages, right? To move out to these communities. And certainly it's very specific people who they help to move out to those communities. Black people are largely excluded from that mobilization, from that movement out to the suburbs, because they are denied mortgages. And, there's redlining, there's a whole history around this. And then, that is really necessary for people to buy all these cars, for people to drive all these cars, for them to fit within the communities that, people are living in, essentially. And that has a lot of consequences, right? When you move all these people out to the suburbs, you expand the footprint of the city. You also kind of deconcentrate the city itself. So a lot of buildings are torn down or become derelict. A lot of room is made for spaces and parking lots within cities. And so there's a huge change there to, the city itself, the ability for the city to fund itself because it loses all this tax revenue to the suburbs. Like there are a whole load of consequences that come of this. And it's certainly not positive for, I think the cities themselves. And we're only now starting to see more of a, I guess, resurgence or return to the city we've seen in the past number of years. But then there's also questions as to whether COVID is going to change that too.
Well, and as the city expands, though, public infrastructure or public transport, I should say, does not keep up with it, right? So all of these cities now have kind of outskirts where it's more difficult for people to get into the city, to move around, and it creates a new class of people, essentially, right? You could call it gentrification as well, in a way, where purchasing a car is not an option, and yet the city's so much more sprawled out that transportation is more difficult, and there is not the transportation investment that allows for mobility in those new communities and areas.
Absolutely. It's interesting when you go back to like the earlier proposals for the build out of streets and highways, and you see how they were multimodal, right? There was a recognition that there'd be space for cars, but there'd also be space for like a train or a streetcar or whatnot within these street designs. And then over time, you see that start to go away because the focus just becomes these are for cars, everything is for cars. We need to encourage people to be in cars. And certainly the automakers and the other interests around that are pushing that forward, are pushing that vision for the city and for the transportation system. And so you do get not only our public transit systems not expanded to those suburban expanses, so people living out there have to own a car to get around, but even within the city, the transit system degrades, right? It doesn't cover the same degree of space as it used to. The streetcars are pulled up in many cities, so you lose that public transit, and when they're replaced by buses, it's much easier to kind of curtail bus routes and things like that. And even in New York, for example, the subway expansions of the subway, improvement of the subway really doesn't get the same kind of energy and
Yes.
effort as it did before.
That's really what I mean. We're here in Brooklyn, and so that's what I was thinking of in terms of, like, the subway expansion in Manhattan. The subway is all over the place in those areas, but in Queens, in other parts of Brooklyn, it's much harder to get around, even still to this day. But so the suburb comes around. The car industry is, pushing this onto people, and the government is following suit. How did the car contribute to the shrinking of public spaces during this time as well?
Absolutely. Like I was saying, there needed to be all this space for the car, right? To park your car, to drive your car. And that required pulling back these public spaces, turning them into parking lots. It was really like, a war on these public spaces in a sense. But also, you see the desire for capital to take over whatever public space constantly, right? That they can get their hands on effectively. But with the rollout of the car, you really do see the erosion of this. And it's, I think you see it in particular, like you can see it when you look at the American city, but there are particular like examples when you look at European cities as well, because in the post-war period, they are also kind of undertaking this rollout of the car. And, right now, cities like Amsterdam or Copenhagen are associated with cycling and being these kind of bicycle meccas. But when you go back to those moments, like in the 60s and in the 70s, when this transformation is really happening, when this attempt to entrench the car is really happening, you can see these public spaces turned into parking lots. You can see these buildings being torn down for streets. And this transformation is really happening. And over there, there's a successful effort to push back on that and to say, like, no, like this is not acceptable. We can't just have the car take everything over. Deaths are increasing, like we saw in the United States and Canada in the early days as the automobile was being rolled out. And so it really does eradicate like a lot of public spaces because the car takes precedence over all that.
And so public transportation is not invested in. It's deprioritized. How did the taxi come about? When did that come about as because I think that we can then move towards talking about Uber. But how did the taxi get invented and proliferated not just in urban centers but throughout the country?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really interesting. Like one of the examples that Travis Kalanick, who used to be, the CEO of Uber, used to point back to was these jitneys, which were kind of like a proto taxi in a sense. And so, it was after an economic downturn. These people in the early 1900s started buying these old, Ford Model Ts with running boards. And, it wasn't exactly like a taxi in the sense that you would say where you wanted to go and it would take you there, but rather it operated on a fixed route. And if you paid a little bit more, it would kind of veer off the route and take you somewhere nearby, right? And they would usually cost about a nickel. But, they were not really benefiting the city in a sense. At the time, the streetcars were already there. Most people relied on the streetcars. And so, they not only produce tax revenue for the city because they would have been private companies at the time, but in their charters, they also had responsibilities to provide street lighting, to make sure the streets were paved. There were all these other benefits that they provided to the city for their operation. And these jitneys didn't do the same sort of thing, right? They were unregulated. They just kind of popped up and they started taking revenues away from the streetcars. And so they were quickly regulated. And as a result, they weren't really economical anymore because they were just operating just on the line, I guess, of profitability. It was people who had lost their jobs, who didn't have very much money, who were just trying to get by, and there was a lot of competition. And so, after that period, there is more regulation. Taxis do start to emerge in the 1900s, and there is this regulatory framework that's developed in many cities that ensures that the fare is regulated, that ensures that there's a certain number of drivers who are allowed to be on the road, and that ensures both that there's a public benefit because this service is available, but also that the drivers themselves have dependability, right? That they're going to be able to earn a certain wage, or, they're not going to be destitute as a result of working this job. And so that's really important. And even though that gets chipped away at throughout the post-war period, throughout the 1970s through to the 1990s, that is still largely in place when Uber emerges, that kind of agreement that there should be a regulated fare and that there should only be so many vehicles allowed on the street to provide some dependability to the drivers themselves.
Yeah, and in here in New York City, being a driver, you have to invest some money into the medallion, which allows you to be a taxi driver. There's been a lot of pushback to Uber's complete takeover here because oftentimes taxi drivers had to take loans out to get the medallion, and with Uber's incredibly successful lobbying effort, they've essentially been completely marginalized here in the city. It was a way to provide a public service job, even though, of course, we're down this road of individualized public transportation. It was a fairly stable profession for a lot of people here in New York, and I'd imagine in other cities as well, until, of course, Uber takes over.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think you can certainly recognize that the medallion system did have some problems with it, right? That the city was extracting, I think it's fair to say, too much from the taxi drivers in exchange for those medallions. I would never question that. And, the taxi drivers themselves say it and protest against it. But the problem, of course, is that Uber rolls out and it comes with this language that it's a technology company, right? It's not a transportation company. So it should be treated differently because it doesn't fit into this existing framework, even though it's effectively a taxi company that just wants to avoid the regulations and allows you to press a button on your smartphone instead of calling the dispatcher, right? It's not really this huge innovation. It's just using a different interface in order to access the taxi. And so the effect of that, unfortunately, is that there's a lot of media that really buys into what Uber is trying to sell, because especially in this post 2008 period when Uber emerges, you have the recession, you have a lot of people who are out of work and who can't find new jobs because they're not being created to the same degree that they needed in order to return to the income levels that they had before. Uber very much takes advantage of that but there's also the narrative that, we need a new industry to drive economic growth, right? What is going to drive the recovery? And the tech industry is kind of settled on as the one that's going to do that. And so for a period of a number of years, there's a desire to, especially among a lot of people in power, in the media, to accept what the tech industry is saying, right? To accept the promises that it's making about the products that it's putting out into the world, and not to pay as much attention to the downsides. It's not to say nobody did. It's not to say there was no reporting on it, but it wasn't given the same degree of attention that we might see today. And so Uber, kind of decimates the livelihoods of taxi drivers. It says that its drivers will be able to earn good money, and they're only able to do that because Uber subsidizes the service with billions of dollars in losses every year. And so it offers a low price that it is not actually profitable, that it could never actually operate with, and it decimates the conditions of the drivers, both its own and the taxi drivers. And that kind of continues for a number of years to right now. What we're seeing is this concerted effort by Uber to write this new, I guess, labor condition that it's created into law, so that it can not only be used on Uber drivers, but can be used on many other workers as well, to decimate their rights, their benefits, their protections. And that's a serious concern.
Well, I mean, they do it with delivery workers as well. They are at the forefront of the gig economy being the new norm, where traditional, or not traditional, but more the structure of worker protections is being actively undercut by them. So I guess, when they're disruptors, disrupting workers' rights is probably at the forefront of what's necessary for Uber to remain profitable. Because my understanding, and you follow this more than me, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's a lot of concern from shareholders about Uber's ability to even deliver on the promises of making money, because they, for many, many years, were operating at a loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we've seen during the pandemic as well is, Uber trying to figure out what it's actually going to look like to become a company that can actually turn a profit, if that is ever going to happen, right? It has some really, the figures that it uses to report, like its numbers are kind of, it likes to fudge the numbers a bit, I'll put it that way. And it still can't turn a profit even with that. But yeah, there's a definite concern. And what we've seen is that the service is becoming less reliable, because, they've kind of exhausted the pool of taxi or of Uber drivers that they can exploit effectively. And the price is going up as well. A lot of people reporting even that the price of taking an Uber from the airport, or, even to go home, if they are, I guess out at a restaurant or out drinking or something, would be more expensive than if they'd just taken a taxi cab. And we've seen people returning to taxis. And one of the things that's happening now as well is Uber is starting to sign deals with taxi companies in New York City, in San Francisco, in Italy. I'm sure that we're going to see it in more places. And I think the concern there is that, after waging this war on taxi companies, on taxi drivers for the past decade or so.
And we should say taxi unions as well. I mean, there's a taxi driver union in New York City, and that's part of what they are so aggressively undercutting.
Absolutely. No, it's an essential point to make. And, I'm concerned that now what we're going to see is, after kind of decimating this regulatory framework and the conditions of these drivers, by putting the taxi companies on the app, it effectively gives Uber a lot of control over what the future of this industry and what the future of these workers is going to look like.
So what is your take on tech stocks basically collapsing writ large recently? It's not just Uber.
No, yeah, there's many other companies who have certainly experienced that. I think that there are a few things you can look at there. First of all, during the pandemic, a lot of these stocks soared, right? Because we were all inside, we were all on our computers. We could only relate to one another in that way in many cases, because, of lockdowns, or just people, reducing their connections because they wanted to avoid spread of the virus, right? And as a result, a lot of these stocks shot up, like, significantly. And I think now some of them are coming back down to earth, because there's a realization that this was not kind of the new normal. We're not going to be like this forever. Sure, we're going to be using more of these services, but it's not like we're all just going to be hermits inside forever and ever and ever, in the way that they would certainly benefit from if we were. But then the other piece of that is companies like Uber and these other companies like it which have been reliant on this cheap money for more than a decade now, right? Because the interest rates after the 2008 recession were cut incredibly low. There was the quantitative easing in that moment. And so it became really easy to access capital. And so you could run a company like Uber for a decade, never make a profit, but as long as shareholders could make their money back in the IPO when the company went public, that was okay. So I think that there's being kind of a reassessment of that right now. I don't think we're going to see companies like Uber be able to operate in that way going forward, especially if this becomes the new normal with higher interest rates and less easy access to capital. And so I guess we'll have to see how that actually plays out, how they kind of adjust to this period. But I certainly wouldn't think that companies like Amazon or Apple are really in trouble with this.
Gotcha. So let's turn back to Elon Musk now that we've gotten here.
Our favorite person. Yeah.
Oh, right. Naturally. So like he didn't even found Tesla, even though he I think there was some lengthy legal battle that he had to undergo in order to call himself the founder of Tesla. But there was a really long period up until really recently where he was heralded as this savior of the planet, right? Electric cars were the thing of the future, and that was going to help combat climate change. Now, I am in favor of electric cars as a way to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, but talk a bit about the problematic nature of presenting that as a silver bullet to climate change. Although first, do you mind just taking us through the history of how Elon Musk and Tesla got onto the scene in general?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I would just start by agreeing with you that I think electric cars are going to be part of this transition, right? Part of addressing the climate contribution of the transportation system. What I say is more that it shouldn't be the only solution, right? It shouldn't be the thing that we're hoping is going to save us. And so, yeah, Elon Musk really kind of emerges as this guy who's going to save the planet because he buys himself into Tesla after they sell PayPal, him and Peter Thiel and the other people who are dealing with that. And one of the things he does with the money that he takes from PayPal is to invest in this company Tesla. And so Tesla already existed. There were already engineers who were working on it, who had developed this battery technology and this idea for the company. And Elon Musk likes what they're doing. Elon Musk sees promise in this. He wants to be, someone who is associated with this kind of a project. And so he buys into it. And he, becomes one of the key people in the company because he's effectively bankrolling it, right? And so over time, there come to be feuds with the other folks at the company. And eventually they're pushed out and Elon Musk becomes the CEO. For a while, he does call himself the founder, as you say, and that has to be resolved in court because he's not the founder. And they eventually agree that he can call himself a co-founder, even though, he wasn't. But yeah, so, the idea behind Tesla is effectively that we're going to create a luxury electric car, this Tesla Roadster, that is going to bring in the money that we can use to create a more affordable electric car. And then we can use that money to make a more affordable electric car again. And that's the plan with it. It doesn't exactly work out as planned. These cars tend to run into more problems than they expect as they're creating them, in large part because Elon Musk has some demands about how they look and how they work that make them much more difficult to produce. And so, yeah, that creates some problems. There's a journalist, Edward Niedermeyer, who's looked into Tesla really closely. And he basically says that around 2014, there's an important shift that happens in the company where it goes from, trying to promise the new electric car and the new car that it's going to make and to use that to raise money, to starting to make these really kind of out there predictions, right? That they're going to solve the self-driving technology and kind of implement that into the cars, or it's going to do all of these other kind of crazy projects, and to use those bold visions in order to raise more money off of the shareholders, to the degree that Elon Musk said recently that if they're not able to figure out full self-driving, Tesla is effectively worth zero, because it's become so much about like the hype and what's being built up that it's not so much about the electric cars anymore. And I think that's something that's important to recognize about Tesla. And so if we kind of zoom out and look at the broader picture of the electric car, as you were saying, I think that it does serve a role in the transition in addressing the climate contribution of the transportation system. But there's still a lot of problems with it if we are looking at it as the silver bullet, which it's not. And so I think it's really problematic then when people refer to it as a zero emissions vehicle just because it doesn't have the tailpipe emissions. These are still cars that are still on the road that still have all these other problems that we've been talking about. They just reduce the tailpipe emissions and reduce the total emissions to a certain degree. But the electric cars still have a much higher production emissions. And what that means is when it rolls off the production line and when you first start driving it, there's already, a higher amount of embedded emissions in the car because the real savings comes from driving it. The longer you drive it, the more kind of climate benefit that you get. After a certain period, you'll overtake the fossil fuel vehicle. And so if you just have a luxury electric car that you're not actually driving very much, that doesn't give you the climate benefit as if, someone replaces their Toyota Corolla or their Honda Civic with an electric car and is just driving it all the time, right? But the other piece of that is the battery in the car requires a load of mining, like a ton of mining that needs to go into it. The International Energy Agency estimates that in order to build all of these batteries for these cars, if we're just going to pursue a policy of largely replacing fossil fuel vehicles with electric vehicles, that the amount of lithium we'll need is up to 4,200% more, and the amount of nickel and cobalt is over 2,000%. So there's a lot of extraction here. And the problem is that, we're telling ourselves that we're making this green transition to make the world a better place, which is very important, right? But if we're going to do that, are we going to continue these kind of neo-colonial relationships, these neo-imperialist relationships with these countries in the global south that will be doing a lot of this extraction? Or should we think much more fundamentally about the transportation system and the larger kind of systems of society that we've set up to ensure that we're doing more to kind of create a better world instead of just trying to reduce the emissions impact that comes of it?
And you mentioned the self-driving car element. Let's talk about that because to me, it is. I'm reminded of the fantasy of lab-grown meat, which they can make certain little fleshy particles, but for the most part, that is a pipe dream in terms of how much it would cost to create lab-grown meat, and there needs to be muscle tissue that goes into it. I mean, it is not around the bend, but it does attract a lot of venture capital investment for that particular dream. For Elon Musk, it seems clear to me that he is inflating Tesla's stock price by dangling the carrot of the self-driving car, which is killing people on the roads as they test them, and does not seem to be as close as he makes it seem publicly for reasons that involve money. Is my perception accurate?
Yeah, I think your read is pretty spot on.
Okay, good.
I think, the real concerning thing with the self-driving car for me is we've had these promises for over a decade now, right? Google, Uber, Elon Musk have all been the key ones that have been promising us that these self-driving cars are coming. And as a result, it's going to kind of remake the transportation system, right? Because all of a sudden it's going to solve traffic congestion. All of a sudden it's going to solve the human deaths on the road because now these computers will be in charge instead of us dumb humans. And it's going to be more efficient. So you'll solve the climate impact of the vehicles. You won't have to own a car anymore. So we solve that, all these supposed benefits that were going to come of it. And then the vehicles didn't arrive because it turned out that it was actually much more difficult to create these technologies. And so I think the key is that we've been distracted, right, for over a decade when we could have been taking these other measures to actually address the problems in the transportation system, whether it's around traffic or human deaths or the climate impact. But rather, we've kind of been stagnant, right? We could have been making huge investments in transit systems, in improving cycling infrastructure, in building communities that are more oriented around, walking and these transit-oriented kind of ways of life, I guess. But instead, we've said, okay, we can still have these cars and the tech industry will solve these problems with the cars, but then they never actually solve the problems. And so we're still just stuck in this system that I think more and more people are becoming, unhappy with, unfulfilled by, angry with even. And it doesn't work for us. It just works for these companies.
It is a fundamentally neoliberal fantasy that is about, we are going to be saved. We are going to be emancipated by the innovations of these brilliant tech billionaires and the market. And frankly, there's so many layers of lies that I think are involved in that, where, as you say, all of that energy should have been gone towards expanding rail, expanding public transportation, decades before. And there's a reason that our infrastructure is crumbling. That all could have gone towards that, as opposed to inflating the ego of someone like Elon Musk, or, looking to tech for that. And so I think, I'm returning to the Theranos example, how all of those old guys like Henry Kissinger or what was it, George Shultz, how they all got duped by someone like her was because they are they belong to the religion. Jim Mattis, yes, they belong to the religion of neoliberalism, and this was like their ultimate savior, right? This kind of person who was going to revolutionize healthcare through the sheer will, genius, etc. And it seems like it's the same thing with climate change and plus transportation infrastructure when it comes to a guy like Elon Musk or Google with all this, and the Apple car, which is coming around the bend. But
yeah, I'm not sure that Apple car is ever going to arrive.
Right. I mean, none of that is going to solve this. None of that's going to solve this.
No, like, we've really lost the plot, right? In constantly hoping that these wealthy people in Silicon Valley are going to deliver the solutions to our problems. I think for me, one of the really instructive things and enlightening things about looking back at the history of automobility, at, when the automobile emerges and how it becomes entrenched in the city, is to see that it wasn't because this technology emerged on the scene, right? It wasn't because the automobile was invented and all of a sudden it took over. It was because the state acted in a way to ensure that the automobile, that the city was remade for the automobile, effectively, to force people to buy the automobile, to move out to the suburbs. And so then if we look at the challenges that we face today and what is actually going to be needed to address them, it's not just, these supposedly brilliant minds in Silicon Valley making these products that are supposed to change the world. Rather, the state always plays the essential role of at least laying the foundation for these changes that are necessary. It's not the technologies that make these changes, right? We can make policies that encourage the adoption of these technologies, but the technologies themselves do not solve the problems. It's the politics behind them and having a political framework in place that can enable these changes to take hold, that can enable the addressing of climate change and using these technologies in a way that does that, in a way that's equitable for everyone. So if we think about what we need right now, especially when we think about the tech industry and how we're going to solve these huge problems like climate change, it's not just hoping that, there's going to be better climate technologies developed by people like Elon Musk or some new founder who emerges from the valley, but rather we need the government to really step up to the plate and do something serious to address these problems.
So what are some of the visions, you get into this towards the end of your book, what are some of the visions of how our society could be structured in a way that would reorient us towards a more equitable and more climate-friendly society?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, the state plays a key role in that, right? In setting the conditions for that. But really, the state is going to have to be pushed by a public that demands it, right? And so I think if we were looking at what a transportation system and what a city that actually addresses the needs of the people who live in it looks like, it's not, looking for new technologies to integrate into cars, and, so they can drive themselves, or there are bigger screens in the cars, or what have you, but rather to make serious investments in alternatives to cars so that people can leave their cars behind, so that people can get around in other ways. And so that, transit systems and biking and whatnot are not seen as like lesser alternatives to the car, but are equal to, if not better than, being able to get around in it. So serious investments in transit systems in cities, around the United States, in Canada, whether that's expanding subway networks and improving them, whether that's expanding bus networks, whether that's looking at, bus rapid transit systems, but also connecting those to intercity transport systems so that it's easy to get beyond cities instead of just within them, right? So improving Amtrak is something that Joe Biden has talked about doing. Certainly, he should be doing more on that, building more high-speed rail, things like that. Those would be really key. But then also thinking about what it means for the communities when you make those changes, right? It's great to build better transit systems. It's great to build cycling infrastructure. But then what if that causes the price of rents and housing in those communities to skyrocket, right? And so you need to think beyond the transportation system as well, and what it actually looks like to deal with a private housing system and these other systems that we've largely privatized and left to the market, and how those are not serving people either. And so it really does require this kind of larger shift to how we think about cities and transportation and the role of the government in actually serving the public that it's supposed to serve. And I think that's a real vision for what we need to actually address these serious crises, whether it's climate change, whether it's the housing crisis, the rising cost of living crisis, everything else.
Yeah,
The market's not going to do it.
well, you're a socialist writer, right? So I that is the vision. That is the vision. And of course it's aspirational as opposed to right around the corner. So like spare me with the comments on that, guys, please. But but I think one of the challenges too would be a change in our view of private property, because there needs to be a return to certain public spaces coming, in order for the transit to expand in the way that you describe. Because my fear of how eventually we're going to address this problem is that railways will go through the poorest communities. Housing will be demolished in areas where it's the lower cost of living, etc., and more vulnerable communities could bear the brunt of this, of expanding, our rail infrastructure, as opposed to reorienting communities in a more holistic way, as you say.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, we can't see a repetition of what we saw in the post-war period, where highways were being rammed through, Black and poor communities, where redevelopment plans were taking place so that these communities were effectively razed, and people were pushed out. Where public housing towers were created in ways that were specifically designed to kind of separate people from the rest of the city, poor populations and things like that. That needs to be seriously addressed, and it can't be something that is allowed to happen in any kind of improved future. One of the things I'm concerned about is that, when we see proposals for things like better transit systems or bike infrastructure, that in poorer communities, we've seen this in Los Angeles, people can oppose them because they recognize that it will mean, other people moving to their communities and causing their housing prices to rise because they become more appealing because these options are there, right? And so they're being pushed out by these market forces, even though kind of the intention is to make it more accessible for them to access transit services and cycling and things like that. And so, by doing these changes within a market system, we already have these people being pushed away because of what it does to housing prices, and what it does to pushing people away. And so, we need to address that. That requires public solutions and actually, building public housing and things like that. But it also requires thinking about what the impacts of those systems will be, and ensuring that the people who will be affected are actually part of the decisions, rather than just being held on the sidelines and, planners and whatnot assuming that what they know is best for everyone else, right?
Lastly, we had someone write in, and I wanted to read this to you. Techno Pipe Dream says, Paris was so on point about how customers are finally experiencing what Uber was built to lead to. I am from India, and we were paying sky-high prices. Uber is underpaying the cab drivers and auto rickshaw drivers. Drivers are canceling most rides because they don't get to, and it's a shit show. And for tech companies going IPO, investors and shareholders are the priority, not customers or employees.
Yeah, spot on.
Right, exactly. So, the fact that Uber they see their market opportunities internationally as well. So this is not just a problem that is confined to North America.
No, not at all. And all of these tech companies, right, have kind of experienced a global ambition. It's not just expanding and dominating what's happening in the United States, but kind of growing to cover so many other countries and to basically force their model onto everyone else. And so certainly it requires a pushback here, but it's also been encouraging to see greater global solidarity against these tech companies, whether it is Amazon, whether it is Uber, in trying to push back on what they're doing in countries around the world.
Paris Marx, you can read their book, Road to Nowhere, What Silicon Valley Gets Wrong About the Future of Transportation. I'd encourage everybody to check it out. Paris, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on the program. It was great to chat with you.
It was really great. All right. With that said, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program and head into the fun half. Southern Socialist writes, Thursdays are becoming my favorite Majority Report days. The guests you have on these days are bringing the heat with their analysis. And Majority Report revolution rolls strong. Left is best. Thank you, Southern Socialist. I would say that, yeah, Paris was a particularly awesome guest for sure. But with that said, we're going to head into the fun half, as I mentioned. First, though, Matt Left Reckoning, we touched on it a little earlier, but what's happening in the Matt Leckian media universe?
Yeah, and I hope to do a Lex stream on Friday. I do want to shout out candidate David for BK. David is part of he organized the co-op, taxi co-op. He's also running for state senate in New York, District 21, and is part of the DSA slate, actually. And I was supposed to talk to him this afternoon, and I'm not sure if we'll be able to do it because Fran, his partner, has a sickle cell crisis going on right now. So I just want to say people should go to David for BK and help them out with some fundraising on a day like today. So and check out David for BK for more details on that sort of thing. So I just wanted to shout out that.
I'm sorry to hear that. All right. We have Brandon and we have Binder. There they are. Wow, look at that. Very smooth, Bradley. Thank you. What's up, guys?
Hey.
How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Overheating, but doing well. What's nice shirt? There you go, Brandon.
Oh yeah, with a present.
From me? No, did you get that at the live show?
No.
Oh, it was literally a present, like from somebody else?
Oh no, it was from you guys.
Oh, okay. All right. I was like, you can get this for free.
Wow,
what's
Wait,
happening?
I never got a shirt, and I worked there in office for like 5 years.
I also gave Brandon his not me. I delivered Brandon's Kowalski shirt from Kowalski. So a lot of apparel going to Brandon.
I also have a magnet. I have a magnet. This is not like a merch push. Although I mean, it's a good fridge magnet. The shirt's nice, you know. If you're into that kind of thing.
Unbelievable.
There's like a million shirts back here. If you ever come by, Binder, you could definitely get one. There's a ton here.
Yeah, but it's not gifted then if he just grabs it.
Yeah, all right.
It's sweeter if you steal it.
I expect
good point.
Emma to take the 7 train all the way to Queens and
Oh no.
That's that Queens internet.
Yeah. I was just saying, you said it's sweeter when you steal it. I was looking through my basketball cards when I was home, and I still remember the ones that came from PAX that I lifted. There's a Shaq Paint Patrol. I got a Reggie Miller card.
Where'd you lift them from?
The supermarket. They had the cards. I didn't do a whole lot, but it was easy.
I'm gonna call the police.
Yeah, I literally used to be paranoid, because I remember hearing I was like really young, but I remember hearing the thing like they'll follow you out in the parking lot. They won't bust you in the store. So I was looking over my back the entire time my mom was driving me home.
Oh no way!
But yeah, it was always right down by the floor, near the ground, and I put them in my pants or something like that.
Rebel.
So.
That's so cool. I never stole as a kid. I was way too
I was too afraid, except I would do this thing in the grocery store where I was like pretending I was reading, I think, a lot of Boxcar Kids or something. So I was trying to pretend I was in a survival movie. So I'd like get like leaves and vegetables to see, how I could survive. Anyway, What's happening on damn it. All right, the discourse. Bender keeps freezing.
Sick boxcar kids reference, Emma, though. That's a real deep cut. I was
into those books, yeah.
It was the Boxcar Children anyway.
Oh, okay. I mean, Hardy Boys maybe, Nancy Drew, but I haven't thought about the Boxcar kids in years. So we have no. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I just want to drop some Boxcar Children lore on us.
Yes, not maybe later, maybe in the fun half.
Some like comparisons to like Lemony Snicket. Maybe you want to like talk about how he ripped off all his ideas from the Boxcar Kids.
I should go into that lore, but okay. The discourse.
Yes. We have an episode out on the SoundCloud from last week. We haven't had a chance to record. It's been a busy weekend, but I look forward to gracing you all with my dulcet melodies soon. Maybe I'll do a little freestyling on the next episode. Be a little less annoying or more annoying, depending on how you feel about it.
Well, with that, we don't have Binder right now. We're trying to figure out his internet situation, but check out Scam Economy. And check out Doomed.
There've been a lot of scams recently. I imagine, he's going to talk about the Celsius bankruptcy, the various NFT rug pulls that are always going on. It's going to be great.
Yeah. All right. Well, 646-257-3920. We'll be taking your calls, and I am. See you in the fun. Not yet.
Let's go, Binder.
Go.
All right. Hopefully this works. All
Plug.
Right. Tonight, 8 p.m. Eastern time tonight, youtube.com/MattBinder. I will be doing a live. Well, you can join me and watch live the January 6th hearing, prime time. Going to do live commentary. Check out what's going on. Apparently, we are going to get a minute-by-minute detailed presentation of what Donald Trump was doing throughout the January 6th insurrection attempt at the Capitol. It should be interesting. 8 p.m. Eastern time, youtube.com/MattBinder. And that means because Doomed is tonight, Scam Economy gets pushed to tomorrow, usual time, 9 p.m. Eastern time, youtube.com/MattBinder, twitch.tv/MattBinder, scameconomy.com, and doomedcast.com for the podcast version of both those shows. I didn't freeze. I shut off every possible app that could be causing issues.
Hopefully we go.
I'm good for the rest of the show.
Hooray. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half. Bye.
Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. You're nervous? You're a little bit upset? You're riled up?
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude. You want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
Some good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy.
Dance, dance, dance.
Ooh.
Rand Paul. I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabs.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook.
Throw our hands up.
Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me,
Hey, shut up.
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.